This video was made possible by Esportspools, where you can put together a team of the players you think would be really good in an OverWatch team, entirely above board and ethically with everyone's consent, because all the players are listed in fantasy tournaments there. You use like a salary where you pick from among them. It kind of balances out. It's like a salary cap in traditional sports. You can only have so many star players, and so many of the lower ranked players will have to be mixed in if you want to have some of the star players. They also have betting, so you can bet on Overwatch League matches when it begins, presumably. At the moment, bet on Overwatch Contenders and other cups that are going on. Now then, a key topic which has been around since the announcement, the very rumoured leak of the concept of the Overwatch League, before it officially was even announced, was what would happen to existing contracts of Overwatch players who were already on endemic esports teams who won't necessarily be in the Overwatch League, especially as we then later on found out that there was going to be this period where teams would be, some of the teams obviously aren't endemic, and therefore they'd be trying out players. They don't necessarily want to buy an entire team. They want to try a bunch of different players, but practically every one of those players is already contracted to someone. So it was always going to be a quandary. How would Blizzard, how would the teams, the endemic teams, and how would the franchises all kind of work together to solve this problem? So obviously, originally the Overwatch League was set to begin in Q3, quarter 3 of 2017, which has already begun and we're pretty much coming to the end of. So that didn't happen. Now it's supposed to start in December of this year. So what happens to those existing player and team contracts at the point that the Overwatch League starts? Now, Richard Lewis, I believe, has already commented on the past in videos about information he'd gotten that suggested that Blizzard had actually told some of the endemic esports teams something along the lines of like, oh, don't necessarily get teams early on, like wait for the Overwatch League, wait till like everything's kind of official before contracting players. And he kind of speculated that the reason for this was because Blizzard knew that this would be a problem. And so to kind of counteract that, to shortcut around that kind of a problem, they were recommending people didn't get teams so that then only people on the Overwatch teams, Overwatch League spots would then have to worry about getting players, etc. And there wouldn't be all these players already contracted, scouted, and kind of locked up in certain brands that you'd have to pay for the release of, for tryouts, or to sign outright. Whereas obviously in that scenario, if teams had ignored that advice, it's not really advice, is it? It's just like sort of telling someone something that will benefit you and not them, but under the guise of helping them out with the inside info. Instead, if teams didn't do that, presumably they would sign all these teams, they'd get some of the best Overwatch League players, Overwatch League squads, and then when the Overwatch League came along, they'd be in prime position to either take that team into the Overwatch League if they got a slot, fat chance of that, hardly any esports brands from Overwatch or from traditional esports actually did get involved in the Overwatch League, but let's imagine they had, then they could have just taken their brand in there without signing them. More importantly, Overwatch League was already, from the very initial inception, being branded and kind of billed and sold to these big companies, these non-endemics, these big sports franchises, companies and businessmen from outside of esports as a way to come into the space, spend a lot of money. Somehow they're safer and kind of vetted more so than esports people that have been working here for years. Again, Blizzard's way of thinking, not mine. And so the idea was to give them a leg up in a sense, because they then wouldn't have to pay, let's just say hypothetically, I'll give you a team that's not in the Overwatch League. So let's say a team like, who should we pick? TSM. They had a team at one point in time. I guess Rogue thus far isn't in the Overwatch League, right? What if Rogue spot one of the best squads? TSM had a lot of talent going through the doors and a couple that were pretty good from the Kongara days. Rogue obviously had an amazing French team, one of the best Western teams. Rather than having to go and say, well, I want one of the best Western teams that are marketable and have really good players like Soon, etc. So how do I go about getting them? Oh, I have to either negotiate with you to try the player out, or maybe I have to pay you to borrow the player to try him out, or if I want to buy him, I have to buy him from you if his contract doesn't end before Overwatch League starts. Rather than doing that, hopefully, I mean, it's very naive, it didn't happen. If people didn't get involved early on, had it just been able to go to some small org and pay for them, who are just some Overwatch only org, or go to a smaller talent pool of people and there'd be more free agents. Now that didn't happen. Pretty much every good player signed and is off somewhere in some context, because the people in esports are smart. They figured this all out. They got in there. They took up the prime real estate. They got all the good players, and now you have to bargain with them. So unfortunately, what happens beyond that is this problem. Now, here's the thing. One of the reasons that I actually think a lot of orgs didn't get involved early on is part of this. They were unsure about what's going to happen with the Overwatch League. Am I going to get a spot in it? How much is it going to cost to get a spot in it? Also, there was the lack of LANs because Blizzard didn't support the game on an endemic level, on a grassroots level. Therefore, big organisers that would have run big tournaments and wanted to, and some of them who initially did run tournaments, didn't have a big LAN circuit, didn't invest in Overwatch infrastructure because they knew Overwatch League was coming at some point. We still didn't know that what the landscape was going to look like way back last year. And so they didn't want everything to be reset and all their hard work to have been built up and then just thrown in the toilet, like happened in League of Legends, where people like MLG, ESL, etc., DreamHack did these big tournaments, had the big teams, and then Riot was sort of like, oh, thanks for building everything up. I'll just take the baton from here. You guys can't run tournaments anymore, or you can only run them under limited circumstances when I tell you can. And so all that infrastructure you've created and invested in, waste of money, it's now mine and the people who are associating with me, not you. So yeah, there was a concern in that sense. So yes, some teams held out early on and they were like, oh, what's going on with this Overwatch League? Some teams got squads, got players on, but they were still probing, like, am I going to be in the Overwatch League? Am I not? You could see some of the big brands from the endemic esports thinking about this, trying to go ahead and do it. And obviously, in the end, very few legacy, I would just call them endemic, CSGO, League of Legends, organizations actually are in the first season of Overwatch League, despite all the promises. Hey, there's not all the teams announced yet. Bizarrely, barely any in Europe, nearly all North Americans, even the one in Europe's a fucking North American org. So we haven't got that many of the endemics overall, and even some of the ones that are, like NRG, that's a very new org in esports. I wouldn't really call them like a traditional esports legacy org. So here's the problem. Now the issue jumps to, what do those teams do when people approach them and say, well, I'm an Overwatch League franchise spot owner, and I want to try out your player because I'm trying out tons of players. This is the issue, and this is the information that came to me, which was somewhat alarming, and I was able to verify through a few people. Now, this information isn't like hot off the presses right now. I had to go and run it down. I had to wait a little bit, let the story breathe so that people wouldn't necessarily know where it was coming from, because people risked a lot to give me this information. So what I was told was there are top organizations in Overwatch where Overwatch franchises would come to these teams who aren't in the Overwatch League or weren't at that point in time, and they would say to those Overwatch teams, the endemics, I want to try out your player. This could be a star player, could just be a good player, someone they've scouted. And some of these endemic esports orgs were charging up to 5 figures, so we're talking about $10,000 over in some cases, just to try out their contracted player. And that limitation, that boundary set by some of these teams, that price tag, actually led to some of the players in this tryout process not being considered for teams because the buyout was too much or the tryout fee was too much, being just passed over entirely. If you're on the fence, well, I'll go with this other player where I don't know if he's quite as good, but he doesn't have the big tryout fee, so let's try him out instead. Being pushed down the kind of hierarchy of where they needed to be, how important it was to try out these particular players, or in some cases just not tried out entirely due to these exorbitant team tryout fees coming from the esports teams to the Overwatch League franchises. Some of the players in question who were being overlooked or who had these exorbitant price tags were entirely unaware of this situation until some franchises and other esports teams told them about it. Like, oh, that's what your team was doing. They were charging this high buyout fee or high tryout fee in order for you to even try out. So that's why we didn't try you out, or that's why you were kind of pushed down the list overall for the tryouts. Whereas those players think, well, I'm just being tried out if people think I'm good, or I'm being scouted and it's going to kind of give me a sense of where my market value is, or I'm being tried out because they think I'm a good player and would fit with the team. Then you're going to go to a situation where these tryout fees and agreed upon deals were not in the contracts for some of these players. So this was never part of what these teams ever necessarily were in position to do. Now, I don't know the legal status of that, so I won't say it's illegal. You'd have to consult a lawyer on that. Certainly sounds kind of shady though, right? Then there's the fact that Blizzard, to try and get around some of these issues, because they're there to service the Overwatch League franchises, not the endemic teams or the players within Overwatch. They're in a situation where I also got word that Blizzard was trying to strong-arm these teams, who are the endemic teams, and nullify their contracts with the players so that all these players would just be available, like free agents, for these Overwatch franchises to just feast upon and try out and run through and see who they want and just pick and mix and take from them without having to pay the org or necessarily do some special deal with the player who's already contracted elsewhere. And obviously some of the players would rather just be an Overwatch League franchise than their team. But guess what? You sign a contract with your team. The reason why you have to think about why Blizzard might be thinking that way, or might be taking steps that way, or publicly thinking about it within certain circles, is because ultimately what we've learned about the Overwatch League is this. The customer for the Overwatch League, as it stands right now, is the franchise owner. He's the one who's paid the X million dollars to get a spot in the league, and he's the one who has to be catered to and kept happy so that he wants to be a part of this league and is a partner going forwards to make the league successful. The product is the player who's going to be on his team, part of his team, which he's then going to field. Now, in a normal sport, why would the league be involved with all this stuff? But Blizzard is in this sense because all those players are currently locked up in all the esports teams, aren't they? And the esports teams can do things like this, charge a buyout fee or a tryout fee, even just to try him out. Like the players think, well, no one said they're going to buy me, just to try out for a team. His squad can be charging this amount of money. So there's shadiness going on from both Blizzard in the way that they're potentially approaching things. Admittedly, they haven't necessarily done any of that yet. And the teams, certainly, the ones that are doing this in terms of charging the tryout, when it's not in the contract and they've never told the players this is what's happening. So for me, it's unethical. Like the initial approach is already unethical. Like the idea that you're going to charge a certain amount for the tryout, but that was never in the contract. Then there's the fact that Blizzard is essentially looking for ways to bully orgs who have already scouted players out. They've done good work there, finding who's good. They've secured the talents of the players who are good, got them on the contracts. They have fielded the talent, actually got them into competitive games, built up brands of players and teams and fan bases overall. Along comes Blizzard, and as we've seen, there's been this disconnect in how they deal with endemic orgs and how they deal with potential Overwatch League franchises. I've always had a bad feeling about the Overwatch League. Whenever I heard any of this stuff, like I heard how few of these big orgs were involved. I talked to someone, I was like, you don't have an Overwatch League slot. You are huge in esports. And then they would say stuff like, yeah, but you know what? They're not really doing a good job to push it, to sell it to me, actually. It's like a rich boys club. They're trying to get big companies from outside esports, non-endemics. They want to get a big NFL team. They want to get a big NBA owner. They want to get a rich businessman from elsewhere, an entrepreneur, someone who invests a lot of money. They don't necessarily want someone like me who built up a squad over years and has a big presence in esports and has got my own fan base, etc. Because you know what? They're going to make us reset anyway. And might not even be able to take my brand into Overwatch, and therefore we're all at the beginning to them, so they see these guys with more money as more important, as kind of more valuable targets to go after, and they're the true partners they want. So I've always had a bad feeling about that, because it made it feel like they were taking an esports product, saying this is esports, going to sell it to the world as this is esports, look, this is all that esports can do, but then there's barely any people from esports involved in it, or funding it, or controlling and directing it, or partners with Blizzard in it, and all these endemics who built esports to this point where Blizzard could come along and go, oh, my games are esports games. Cool, can I get involved with that? And now all of a sudden, those people are pushed to one side. Like, hey, go to the kids' table over there. The rich guys are talking at the big boy table over here. So I've always had a bad feeling about that. And since Blizzard doesn't do many interviews with esports people or come on talk shows or do interview, guess what? We can't address these topics. Therefore, we are left to speculate on the information we receive. So the idea that teams aren't telling the players that they're bargaining against their value for the tryout fees that were never in their contract, that also seems pretty dodgy. Now, I understand it because some of these teams have absolutely been given a hard road because they thought they were going to get an Overwatch League slot. Or they thought to themselves, right, well, at least I can kind of get something for my players, right? Oh, it's going to start in Q3. Well, I've got my player signed till whatever, November. Oh, what's that? Now it's December. So I've built my entire year's approach on the fact that I was going to be able to sell this player when they wanted to go to Overwatch League, but now I'm not going to get anything. Well, in that case, if you want to try him out now before November, then you better go ahead and pay me this particular tryout fee. And yeah, sad for the player if he gets looked over, but I've got to get something back for this. I've invested money in this. I kind of feel from that way. I don't like the fact that they haven't told the players that this is what they're doing and it's not in their contracts. That's an issue for me. So how much of this is going on? How many teams it's going on with? If it's still going on to this day, if it's cooled down, if some of this has been reined back in, that's another matter. I'll do my best to investigate it and to try and get to the bottom of all these little threads. But this is certainly alarming news when you consider how many careers, how many players careers are in the balance right now of this tryout period, and the fact that we would as fans hope that just the best players are being tried out based on how good they are and based on their legacies within Overwatch, and then tried out for whether they would fit this franchise, this brand, etc. Not for other things like whether or not someone could afford their tryout, whether they even know there's a tryout and therefore have the same options when they're choosing between who to go and try out for, and then whether or not Blizzard is actually allowing the endemics who've built up esports for them right now with very little in return to actually profit from that themselves, or whether they're looking to nullify contracts or to help people get out of them, or maybe that's got something to do with why the Overwatch League was pushed ahead in time as opposed to starting when it should have done, as a way to get around some of this, because then you'll be able to sign these players when their contracts end. It's certainly something that's a little bit alarming. It's not necessarily the end of the world right now. I don't know the legal status of it. I won't speak on that. I have no clue. But just ethically, personally, I think it's a pretty shady set of circumstances.
Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top 3 asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.